Hello and welcome to the Hoover Institution's 2015 Spring Retreat. I'm Chris Dower, Hoover's Director of Marketing and Strategic Communications. Our speakers in this chartcast are Herbert Lin, a Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and John Villasenor, a National Fellow at Hoover. The title of their talk is Emerging Challenges in Cybersecurity, and it was recorded on April 21st, 2015.
Both John and I are here to talk about some of the really interesting things in cybersecurity going on here at Hoover and Stanford at large. What I wanted to talk about was a particular aspect of cybersecurity that's getting more and more attention, but only sort of under the table. There's some rumblings about it, as you'll see in a minute. This question is, you all know that there's a cybersecurity issue, that companies are getting hacked left and right. Here's some headlines about it just recently. And the issue here is that everybody gets hacked, and it just seems like the guys who are getting hacked just have to sit there and take it. And so that, this question of should this private sector be able to respond in a more offensive way, counterattack in some sense of the term, is really an interesting question. So there are a variety of these headlines all have to do with the controversies that have come up. This is just a random sampling of them. The Google search that I did on this was private sector hackback or something like that. Hackback is somebody hacks you and you hack them back sort of in response. Okay, and this issue is starting to come up more and more. It is, and here's the problem, right? There's two kinds of companies in the United States: those who've been hacked and those who don't know that they've been hacked. I wish I could claim that that was an original comment. It comes from Director Comey of the FBI. And this is just a sampling of some recent high-profile hacks of various sorts. You know the words, right? Target, Anthem, Home Depot, Sony, JP Morgan, and so on. And private correspondence has been revealed. Lots of data has been stolen. Maybe some of you were affected personally by the Anthem hack if your healthcare records were there. Excuse me. And then certain computers have been turned into bricks. Now, what I mean is that the computer with its operating system erased and the chips inside it that started up have been turned into paperweights. So this computer is now a brick. It's good for holding open a door. That happened to Sony. And that has happened in other cases as well around the world. And this is not a good thing if you're the owner of the computer. Sony's backup plan was to go to the closet and take some old stuff out of the closet and reattach it. So this isn't news anymore that these guys that lots of players are getting hacked. And so today, if you're a private sector victim in cyberspace, if you're going to respond, you have very limited response options. Okay. In principle, you could do any one of these four things. By implementing passive defense measures, what I mean is that you strengthen your defenses. You update your system to make sure that you have all your vulnerabilities that you know about are patched. You install the most recent antivirus software, that kind of thing. That's passive defense. You can call the cops. You can call the FBI, and the FBI is pretty good about this sort of stuff. Okay, if you're a big player and so on, they will try to help you. You can do self-help to investigate the source of the attack and report the information to authorities. Okay? Self-help is when you go out and you do your probes and you look around and see who's attacked you and get information about them. And then you can, sort of the extreme case, you can act to negate the ongoing penetration. That is, you can hack back. Okay? Now, of these four options, only the first two are legal. Okay? In the United States. So some realities to consider. That's the enhanced passive defense and law enforcement assistance. So on enhanced passive defense, it's the least controversial. Nobody will argue with you if you do that. Nobody will threaten you with jail or anything. It's the least controversial. On the other hand, by putting up passive defenses, dropping connections of people who are talking to you or what have you, you may reduce your own functionality. You may be unable to serve all the people that you're talking to. So for example, if you mistakenly, let's say you're the victim of an attack that's coming in through the internet, you could drop the connection. But let's say that traffic contains legitimate customers as well. Now you've just really upset a bunch of customers. Not a good thing to do in the long run. And enhanced passive defense over the long run is unlikely to be effective. Because when you put up a brick wall, they get a ladder. And you know, when you try to push over the ladder, they tunnel underneath. You know, that kind of thing. Law enforcement assistance. Can you call the cops? Yes, you should call the cops. But law enforcement takes months to operate, not minutes. Right? I mean, you call the cops and they come and they put you in line. I mean, their answer is get in line, essentially. They have an orientation towards prosecution rather than prevention or mitigation. They want to catch people and lock them up. Preventing is less in their mission set, although that's starting to change at the FBI. Most importantly, law enforcement resources are limited. Okay? There's not an infinite amount of manpower available. So that's why you get in line. The bottom line is that there's no good way to stop the pain of a cyber attack using these options. No good way to stop it immediately. Okay. So it turns out that the Department of Defense has said, this is official US policy, in order to defend our networks, Defense Department networks, we reserve the right to go after the guys coming after us. The Department of Defense, you'd expect them to say that, right? And the US government has said this is appropriate policy. This is published. Okay. So if it's good for the DoD, why isn't it good for the private sector? That is, why shouldn't more aggressive responses for defending non-DoD assets be encouraged and possible? Well, so why shouldn't self-help be possible? Okay? Be encouraged. Lots of the private sector has expertise. Google has a lot of expertise about information technology. They have large information technology infrastructures. Some of them have expertise in penetration. This particular company, whitewolfsecurity.com, has a long blurb on its website about the value of conducting offensive operations as a defensive technique. It doesn't say that it does it, but it has a long blog saying this is why it's a good thing to do. Okay? They have the motivation to do it, right? They're going to protect themselves. They're not going to wait around for the FBI or some other agency to help them. So they're highly motivated. There's self-interest here. They have some political support, too. For example, in 2003, Orrin Hatch proposed legislation that would give copyright owners to destroy the computers of copyright violators given sufficient warnings. Okay? It was a serious legislative proposal. Lots and lots of policy issues here, and technical and legal issues regarding self-help. The law would have to be changed, at least clarified. Right? Are you allowed to shoot back in cyberspace if you're the victim of an attack? Can you act under some sort of self-defense rubric? That's never been tested in court. The law does not say you can do that, but there's no explicit prohibition of that either. It has yet to be tested in courts. Will it really help? Okay. Retaliation can only reduce future losses. It can't help. It can't stop the pain right now. And neutralizing the threat in real time is really hard. Okay. Will it actually be useful to law enforcement? It's an interesting question. Maybe the private sector has more and better resources for forensics than the FBI. Certainly, in some cases, does. A bank, for example, knows everything that's going on its network. The FBI doesn't, and it's hard for the FBI to get that. At what point do you respond? Okay. Is it the last resort? Well, I sort of would like to think that sort of shooting back in cyberspace is the last resort. But what does last resort mean? Do I have to have first taken best practices, done best practices to defend myself? How about if I leave my door open, figuratively speaking, and let anybody come in? Can I go after them then? That doesn't seem like a good idea. But then, how do you specify the level of best practice that you need to do before you're allowed to hack back? Do you have to demonstrate competence at hack back? That's an interesting question, right? You know, you have Brinks guards and so on. They train at a range and so on. They have to get certified. How are we going to train our cyber guys to hack back in a responsible way? What's the standard for attribution, for knowing who's coming after you? Okay. Is it beyond a reasonable doubt? Is it clear and compelling evidence? Is it preponderance? What, you know, these are legal terms. I don't propose to go through all of that now. But how certain do you have to be, and how do you measure that? Okay. How do you guard against mistakes in attribution? Maybe you go after the bad guy, only it turns out he's not the bad guy. Maybe it turns out to be one of your computers, you know, yours, that somebody else has hacked in order to go after a bank. Okay, I could take over your computer, and then it looks like you're doing the attack. Okay, what's the liability if the bank attacks you? Okay, I don't mind about that, but you know, you might. You know, there's a collateral damage. What's the liability? Okay. Who does the hackback? Is it the company? Is it the US government? Is it a hackback service provider? I kid you not. There are firms around the world, in many parts of the world, where hacking is not illegal, that provide this as a service. Okay? You don't like somebody for whatever reason, give me X dollars and I'll conduct a cyber attack against them. Part of their business model. Okay? Does the US government do the hackback? That's an interesting question. The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act doesn't apply to law enforcement agencies or intelligence agencies, okay, explicitly. Is this a wise thing to do? Could it interfere, for example, with US operations, US government operations in hacking? Yeah, you can imagine that. Maybe it gets attributed to the US government. Here's an interesting question. Let's say you want to hack back. I mean, do there have to be standards for hacking back? Sure. How would you establish the standards? Maybe some sort of government regulation, or establishing minimum standards, or some sanctioned body has to create those standards that everybody has to adhere to. Now, if somebody hacks back underneath that rubric, is this endorsement of the US government? If it isn't, why isn't the US government trying to shut it down? But then again, do I really want every individual company out there deciding on its own what standards to use for hacking back? That gets to be a mess too. I want to set forward a proposal for discussion. I want to say at the beginning, I think this proposal that I'm going to set out here is a bad idea. I don't want to be quoted in the press saying, Lin advocates this. I don't advocate this, but I'm doing this as a way of showing the kinds of issues that come up. Okay? You give a certified private company certain rights for offensive responses. Certification means they meet minimum standards for best practices for security, best practices for attack assessment, and so on. And they're competent to do attribution and to hack back safely. Okay? They have to, before they hack back, they have to seek permission from a standing body, an adjudicative body, to conduct offensive action. Action is only allowed with permission. Okay? And it's sort of court-like, but it has technical expertise. It knows the history of complaining companies. It's responsible for factoring the national interest in allowing a response. Okay, so that means it has to be talking a lot to the US government. If you want to hack back, you have the responsibilities. Maybe you have to, for example, you accept liability for exceeding your authority and doing some effective action. Okay. 2 levels of offensive action. Okay. One is non-destructive reconnaissance and intelligence gathering on behalf of law enforcement activities. That is, you try to find out who is, you hack back only to collect information. Okay? And you give that to the law enforcement authorities. And there are conditions to it. No liability if you do it in accordance with the guidelines, and you don't use this data that you find for competitive advantage, that you use it only for security purposes. Okay? Level 2 is a lot stronger. You can take destructive action against bad guy computers, and you have liability due to mistaken attribution, even if you conducted it in accordance with all the guidelines. So this is a proposal, okay, a possibility. I think, as I say, I think this is not a good idea. Okay? But it illustrates many of the ideas that are associated, many of the issues that come up when you think about aggressive private sector responses. This is me. If you're curious about this topic. This is an active area of research, and happy to talk to any of you about this. Anyway, that's my time. John?
Thank you very much, Herb, and thanks to all of you for being here this morning. I know it's early, and try to make sure your time is well spent. I'm going to follow up by giving you a different cybersecurity issue, one which is unfortunately not getting nearly the attention that I believe it deserves, and I'll explain why. And so that's why I've titled the talk here, Hardware, the Other Cybersecurity Challenge. We talk a lot about cybersecurity. I would imagine these days there's probably multiple news articles every single day on the topic. But it's almost always about software. And just to make sure that I'm not leaving anyone confused by using terms like this, let me sort of take a high-level view and introduce some terminology that you may have seen. We often speak of integrated circuits, which are sometimes called ICs. They're also sometimes called computer chips, and you know, pretty much any electronic device these days, if you were to kind of open it up and look inside, you'd see some of these computer chips. These are the kind of electronics hardware built using typically such as materials such as silicon. So that's hardware because it's physically, you know, devices and things. Software refers to the set of instructions that tells a chip what it's supposed to do. So and all our devices and systems run thanks to this combination of software and hardware. So for example, when you're using the internet browser or writing something on Microsoft Word or using Excel, then the actual computations are being done by one or more chips, and those chips are, the instructions for what's being done are involved in software. So I'm going to focus on the chips themselves, because that's a big vulnerability for cybersecurity. Let me just sort of stop, before I even go further, let me say, where are chips, integrated circuits? Well, they're probably in most of your pockets or handbags or whatever else you're carrying, because they're in every mobile phone. Without chips, mobile phones wouldn't work, tablets wouldn't work, the internet wouldn't work. Chips they manage anti-lock braking in cars, they control the position of the flaps on a modern airliner, they control ATM machines, they manage financial transactions, everything from as small as using a credit card to buy $10 worth of groceries up to every single trade that occurs in Wall Street and around the world on the global financial market, the electronic financial markets. They run the stock market, they run the electricity grid, they run our communication systems, and they store and access information. So it's really no exaggeration to say that without chips, without integrated circuits, life as we have come to know it today would really be completely different. I mean, almost every interaction we have with any sort of device or system involves computer chips. We cannot overstate the importance of these devices. The concern is that while we are so focused on, and we should be focused largely on software-based cyber attacks, the kind you read about every day if that's something you search for, we are ignoring or largely ignoring an incredibly significant vulnerability in the hardware that is running all of the things that I just told you about and much more. So it's a bit sobering to imagine, what could a cyber attack based not in software but actually in the underlying hardware do? Well, it could stop or impede the chip and then therefore the system that contains it from functioning. It could exfiltrate data, and what I mean by that is it could send data out while making the chip appear to be functioning normally. So you would think that everything is fine. You look at it, it's humming along just like it's supposed to, but in fact, it's surreptitiously sending out data that the attacker wants to get for some reason. It could corrupt data. You could put one number into the chip, and then a corrupted chip could turn it into a different number, and then when you get the number back, you don't know it's been changed because you don't know all these numbers, but it's been changed. Or some combination of the above. There's lots of bad things that could happen if you're attacking from the hardware level. Let me explain why this is a problem which is so much more significant or potentially significant today than, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago. So if you think about the chips that are in all the devices that you have, before they're actually in products, they're manufactured. And this is a picture showing a sort of a chip. On the upper left is a chip inside some sort of a system. And in the middle of the picture here, you see these circular things. These are called wafers. And And you can see each wafer here has a bunch of little rectangular things on it. Each one of those things are going to become chips. And this is what comes off in a fabrication facility that makes things like the chips in your mobile phones. And so what happens is these circular wafers, you can think of a proverbial pair of scissors being used to cut these up and extract each one of these little rectangles on those wafers, and each one of those rectangles then becomes the chip that goes into your mobile phone or your tablet computer or whatever it is. So that's the manufacturing process. But before you get there, before you make these things, these chips are designed. In other words, obviously when you manufacture a chip, the manufacturer has to know what to do, right? And so the design process is the process of deciding what exact electronic circuits are going to be on that chip. And they're designed in places like Silicon Valley, where, of course, we are right now. They're also designed in places like India, which in recent years has, as I think many people in this room know, has this enormous business of offshoring design of electronic systems to places like that because of lower labor costs. And then more recently is China. Has become a major global center for where these chips are designed. The concern is that if I go back, and by the way, I'm not the first person to suggest that hardware is a concern. In fact, back as early as the 90s, early 2000s, the U.S. government and many other people were concerned that manufacturing might pose problems to the integrity of our integrated circuit, our chip supply. As many of you may remember, it was in that era, sort of the, starting even before that, but certainly in the 90s, where manufacturing of chips started going, or was very significantly moving offshore. And it's just because many of the biggest manufacturing facilities, for all the reasons that you might expect, are not here in the United States. And so what would happen then is people would, let's say, design these chips here in the United States, and then to actually physically make them, they would contract with a manufacturer, typically located somewhere in Asia. And so some folks in the U.S. government thought, well, gosh, that is going to create some security concerns, because suppose the manufacturer doesn't make what you told them to make, but instead makes something that looks like what you told them to make, but actually is a little bit different in some way that's corrupted and intended to do something malicious. And so there were some programs, and still are some programs, aimed at addressing that issue. The problem is that the landscape has changed, but the mitigation measures have not. Specifically, the design process is no longer one that is in many ways fully controlled by people that you know. In a typical chip, chips are enormously complex, and it's very, very unusual for one company or one entity to do all the design. A much more common common approach is what I've illustrated here. This is an attempt to illustrate a very high level of chip. So you can think of the big rectangle here as an integrated circuit. And of course, these things are immensely complex. But at a high level, you can think of, on the left, there's stuff coming in and there's stuff coming out. And then on the chip, there's some memory, because it's got to store some information. There's something called a system bus, which is a term that just refers to the sort of like the interstate highway that for data to move around. And if data needs to go from memory to one of these blocks, it's going to get on the highway and go to the block and get off. But the chip then also has a bunch of sort of sections on it that do different things. So block one might have the function, if this is in a mobile phone, block one might receive signals and turn them into video, and block two might do some encryption and decryption and so on. So they do these different functions. So if you're in charge, let's say you've got a company in Silicon Valley, and you're in charge of designing a new chip that's going to look a little bit like this, you couldn't generally afford you would not be cost effective to design all of these things yourself. Too expensive. It would take too long. You don't have the people. Rather, what you might do is say, okay, well, blocks 1, 2, and 3, those are sort of unique to my application, so I am going to hire some people and design those here. But blocks 4, 5, and 6, there's already people who have designed stuff that does that. And rather than have me spend 12 months and $500,000 or whatever the number would be designing those blocks, I'm just going to go buy the designs from somebody else, either here or overseas, for much less, a tenth of that price, for example, who's already done the design. They're going to give me the design, and then I'm going to incorporate the design into my chip and get the whole thing physically manufactured and so on. So you can see the obvious problem that occurs here, which is that you're buying, when you're buying a product, essentially a black box, and you don't know what's inside it, you are placing a lot of trust in the person who is giving you that black box, that they have in fact put inside the black box what you have told them to put. Now, you would say, well, we can test it. Of course, you're going to test it. But the problem is these chips are so complex that it is no longer possible to do testing to ensure that they actually always are going to do what they say they're going to do. I'll give you an example, a very simplified example. Suppose that you have asked someone to give you a design for a piece of a chip that's going to add 6, okay? So after a month or whatever it's going to take in the design, they come back and they say, here you go, here's your block that adds 6. And of course you're going to test it. So what you do is you might say, well, let me put 20 into this little thing and see what happens. And you look and say, hey, 26 comes out. It's really adding 6. That's good. And you say, I'm going to put 127 in there. And you look and 133 came out. It added 6 again. That's really good. And you're going to do 100,000 more times. And every single time, it's going to add 6. So after that, you'd be like, great. Thank you. You may give me a block that adds 6, and you pay them, they go away. That's fine. But suppose that there's one input and only one, where something else happens. Suppose that if the input is 126,321,204, it doesn't add 6. Instead, it starts an attack. There's absolutely no way that you would have ever found that in testing, because if you just don't have the time. You would take years, decades, centuries to actually test every single possible input to every single possible function on one of these electronic devices. These devices are so complex now, these chips, they can have literally many billions of transistors. They're quite literally like cities, little cities about this big, and you just can't possibly explore every nook and cranny. So the problem is that the testing methodologies that we have are good at and are designed for finding mistakes, right? So if the person you asked to build you a block that adds 6 screwed up and instead built you a block that adds 4, just because they weren't competent, then it would be easy to find, right? You'd put in 20 and it would give you 24, and you'd say, hey, you didn't add 6, you added 4, and they said, gosh, you're right, I screwed up, I'm sorry. But these testing methodologies are not intended and were not designed and are incapable, generally, of finding defects, malicious defects that were intentionally placed in a chip with the idea of making them nearly impossible or essentially impossible to detect. And we have today essentially no defense for anything like that. Our entire infrastructure lacks the ability to find these things, much less to do something about it once they are found. So the obvious question is, what do you do? What should we do? I will identify very briefly these 4 points, and then I'll hand it over to for questions and answers, but just 4 points to think about. One sort of takeaway is that intentional corruption of hardware, and therefore of the systems that the hardware runs, which is everything, is a key cybersecurity exposure which is getting essentially no attention. And there's a tiny, tiny set of people looking at this, but it is very, very small, not sufficient. So we need 4 sort of prongs or pillars of kind of a solution here. One is simply better awareness, right? The people need to understand that if we're going to solve cybersecurity, we're going to need to solve not only the sort of traditional software level cybersecurity, like making sure that networks and systems have the right kind of robust security, but also understand and expect that these things are going to be corrupted. I'll give you a quick anecdote. I'm old enough, and probably many of you are as well. I'm old enough, and probably many of you are as well, to remember the American embassy in the Soviet Union that was built back. It was back, wasn't it, the 80s or something, where we had an embassy that was built, and if I remember the story correctly, we had actually the Americans had hired some Soviet, people to kind of be involved in the construction, and surprise, surprise, what did they do, right? They built, I remember reading an article that called the entire building one giant microphone, and so at great cost and great length of time, then I think physically a large part of that building had to be physically sort of unconstructed and then reconstructed in a manner where there weren't sort of bugs behind every doorknob or something. If you think about it, of course, if you ask, the Soviets to build your embassy in Moscow, they, among whatever else you might say, they were not dumb, so they did what you'd expect. And so But we are doing, in many ways, the same thing today with our integrated circuits. We are asking people all over the world, some of whom are indifferent to our security needs and some of whom are arguably directly hostile to our security needs. We are asking them to build things for us, things where we do not have the ability to see what's inside. And should it really surprise us if sometimes that is taken advantage of in ways that are detrimental to potentially our interests? So we need better awareness. We also need to change design practices, the second point here. Right now, the way these chips are designed assumes trust. And you might say, well, in lots of other domains, you don't assume trust, but in this domain you do. And the reason is it's sort of like the internet. When the internet was first created, as everyone here knows, it was just an academic network, and it was an assumption, and a reasonable assumption at that point, that people could be trusted, that the people on the network were all sort of no one was acting maliciously. And of course, as the internet matured over 20 years, we all learned the hard way that not everybody on the internet is trustworthy. And so for decades, we've been sort of recovering from the initial assumptions of trust that, of course, have turned out to be misplaced in a world where there's plenty of malicious actors. The design practices for integrated circuits have not gone through that vital process. They still basically assume that everyone's trusted. So if I contract with a design house out in India or China or whatever it is to give me a block that's going to do something, then people test it for functionality, but they assume that the people are basically trustworthy. They're not trying to be malicious. That's the entire culture is still built around that, and that unfortunately is no longer a match for the ecosystem we have. We also need technology to counter these attacks, right? When an attack occurs, what do you do? And so I've proposed, for example, building in what the equivalent of a police force into a chip, right? So that you can have a portion within a chip that's watching carefully what's going on, and if something is not right, it can pounce, in milliseconds instead of weeks or months or years. And then response preparedness. To my knowledge, and the caveat is there's plenty I don't know, but to my knowledge, we are not fully prepared or even partially prepared for a significant hardware-based cyber attack on critical infrastructure. I think there's a number of chilling scenarios that you can envision, and it's not even clear to me who would be in charge if such an attack were to happen. And it's pretty clear to me that whoever or whatever groups might be in charge probably don't have all the knowledge and the skills needed to effectively counter an attack like that. We have not had a hardware attack that has forced people to give attention to this, and it's hard, as everyone here knows, it's hard, very hard, to get people to direct resources to preparing for attacks of a different class that haven't occurred. I mean, the example is if I had, in March of 2001, if I had gone on a campaign to try to convince airlines to secure cockpit doors, people would have politely nodded at me and said, that's an interesting idea, and now we've got other things to do. And of course, after September 11th, we managed to secure cockpit doors within a few weeks. So it's unfortunately hard to get people to proactively put in security measures that could be important. I'm happy to take some questions, and I very much appreciate your time. Thank you.
For more podcasts and chartcasts from the Hoover Institution, please visit hoover.org or Hoover's channels on iTunes, iTunes U, and Stitcher. I'm Chris Dower for the Hoover Institution. Thank you for listening.